So, basically, let's see here. The basic argument, real quick here, is that objective morality points towards God. So, if morals are objective, then they are obligations for people to follow. There must be a source where those morals originated from as an obligation to live by. The most reasonable origin of genuine objective morals is an external personal being, or what we would call God. Okay? People can have morality without believing in God, so just make that first of all. There's a lot of people hear this and say, oh, you're saying, atheists can't be good people, and they very much are good people.
Could you just do it one more time?
What was that?
Could you just go through it one more time?
Yeah, so if morals are objective, then they are obligations for people to follow, and there must be a source where those morals originated from as an obligation to live by. And the most reasonable thing would be a God. So, and you can be moral without God. You could be an atheist, agnostic, or other non-religious person, have strong morals, and be a good person. You can actually be better than a lot of religious people, a lot of Christians. Belief in God is not a prerequisite for morality. But if there is no God, then there couldn't even be objective morality to start with. So that's really kind of the point I'm going to be making. So, there's a lot of different directions you can go with this. I just wanted to start with actually a moral argument as proof against God. So a lot of times, opponents to God in Christianity will use a moral argument as proof against God. So, let's see, popular atheist author Richard Dawkins, you've probably all heard of him. He offers what I consider a moral criticism of God in his book, The God Delusion. Has anyone here read that book? Yeah, a few people. So this is a pretty common quote. A lot of people know this. Let's see here. So I'm going to read it to you. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. So, strong words. I mean, you kind of wish he'd tell you what you really thought, right? So, I was going to point out 3 problems I see with this. First off, saying that God is immoral is not actually an argument against God's existence at all. Right? No one would use that line of reasoning against anyone else. No one's going to say, Hitler didn't exist because the things he did were too bad. Right? And that's really what he's getting at here. He's saying the God of the Old Testament did all these horrible things, so he can't exist. It's just not logical to make that. Second of all, saying that the creator of the universe is evil is quite arrogant, really, when you think about it. If there really is a creator of the universe who's above all else, created everything else, set everything in existence, certainly that creator would have the right to interact with his creation any way he felt like it. I don't really see any other way around that. What his creation determined to be good or bad, like what we think is right or wrong, it's kind of irrelevant compared to what God says. I mean, if there is a God that's above everything else, that creates everything, really, what we say we like and don't like, it's just our personal opinion. It's irrelevant in comparison to a creator. Such a being, if he did exist, would have authority to deem any action he chose to either be good or bad, and it wouldn't be up to date by his creation. Okay, so third here, and this is really where it gets to the moral argument. So, Dawkins here is unequivocally speaking against the idea of a biblical God by claiming that he is immoral. Right? The problem is he's trying to use morality to disprove God, is that without God existing, to set the objective moral standards in the first place, there's not an absolute standard to even judge God by. Like, we're only left stating our own personal opinions, which are free to be disagreed with or ignored. Someone could just as easily hear that quote from Dawkins as a praise to God. And I'm sure there's some people that do. If they consider those actions that he says is virtuous, then they're going to say, sure, it's good. Without God, there cannot even be objective good and evil, right or wrong, moral or immoral. So that's really the point there of this whole argument. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit, talk about our culture a little bit. So our culture is very much at odds with itself. We all know that. We all live in a culture and we all realize how weird it is, even though we're a part of it. Our culture is very relativistic, means we think a lot of things are open for personal opinions to supersede traditional societal norms. We tend to frown on people who are pushing their specific ideas onto others, especially when it comes to religion and morality. Religious people are promoting their ideals are often labeled as fundamentalist. They're also labeled a lot of other things, extremist, narrow-minded, hateful. Deceptively, relativism is taught in our culture as the only objective truth. So think about that for a second. The only thing that's truly true is that everything's relative. That's what we hear all the time. Our culture also tends to be very focused on inclusivity and accepting of others, including their beliefs, cultures, ideas, lifestyles. Tolerance and acceptance are accepted as kind of the epitome of our society and of perfection. And then that idea of tolerance is juxtaposed against Christian beliefs. And it's pretty interesting. We talk up tolerance, and then we teach it against Christianity as if Christianity is narrow-minded, and Christians are often judged for being intolerant. But interestingly, though, tolerance and unconditional love towards others is something somewhat unique to cultures with a Christian background. You're not going to see a lot of other cultures that don't have any Christian influence that are very much into tolerance and diversity and love towards others, especially towards enemies. While we teach tolerance of many things in our culture, Christian beliefs is not one of them anymore. Our culture is extremely intolerant of intolerance, which is another one to think about there for a second. We tolerate everything except for intolerance, which you'd think if we're really about tolerance, we should tolerate even those who are intolerant to some degree. But that's not the way it is. And intolerance is how Christians and Christian beliefs are viewed. Also, people will also argue against religious ideas of morality by saying it's arrogant for religious people to push their personal ideas onto someone else. Anyone see any problem with that? It's not really an argument, but them pushing their ideas onto us. It's they're pushing their philosophical ideas onto others, which is the very action they're condemning Christians of. It's just kind of a way that they're claiming that they have absolute authority and that they're not subject by the same rules they're trying to put everyone else under. So basically, they're rejecting morality for moral reasons. Another kind of odd thing. Starting to see how our culture it's a little bit at odds with itself. So, what this really comes down to is, for morality, it's either going to be objective, meaning that it applies to everyone at all times, it's always the same, it's always true, or it's going to be subjective, meaning it can vary, and it can change through times, through, whatever. Now, if morality is objective, then it must be based on a standard outside of humanity for it to remain consistent and true, regardless of varying opinions. If there's a creator that sets such morality, then it can be obligatory for people to have to follow it and obey it and be held accountable to it. And this seems to fit best with how most people view morality. Now, if instead morality is subjective, then we have to ask, who or what is it subjective to? Right? We always hear that things are subjective, but that means it's subjective to something. Who or what is that? Some people are going to say that it's subjective to each individual. Like every person gets to choose their own morality. Everyone gets to make up their own right and wrong. Everyone gets to, basically set morality. Other people are going to say, no, that doesn't quite work, but morality is instead, it's set by a group of people, either your culture or your society or your time period or humanity as a whole. So those are kind of the two ways that people are going to lump it. There's others too, but these are the main two. So I'm just going to talk about those for a little bit here. So morality, first off, can't be subjective to individuals. I think we all know this, but I'm just going to run through this real quick anyway. If it was subjective to individuals, then everyone could choose morality for themselves, and they're free to do whatever actions they feel are best, and they're not accountable to others, nor should they be judged by others. Everyone, if if morality is subjective to each individual, then everyone has equal valid authority, and no one has the right to criticize anyone else's actions or act like they're violating any set of moral obligation. So I don't think many people want to argue that. I mean, I don't know too many people that do, but there are a few. The more common one is that morality would be subject to groups of people, and I don't think that works either. So morality can't be subjected to groups of people. It's common philosophy that they're subjective, either to your society or your culture, or a lot of people will say, well, whatever your country is, you can set your own morality for that country. This line of thought teaches that people can come together and agree on what's moral and immoral in their society. But this subjective idea of morality runs into some serious problems. Here's a few of them. So if morals are decided on by a culture, if that's true, then what right does any culture or society have to criticize any other culture or society for their differing morality, right? I mean, we look at a lot of other countries, like, it's so horrible what they do over there. How can they even act that way? What's wrong with them? If every bit of morality is just based on your own culture and what you decide, then we don't have any right to say that what they do is right or wrong. I mean, if that's the case, then they're just as right as we are. Okay? Morality has varied widely throughout different societies, and I doubt there's very few people that are willing to say that all of those different moralities through all different times of history and all different cultures, that all of those were acceptable. You may run into a few people, but most people are not going to be willing to go down that road, because it's a pretty broad amount of immorality that we see. Many practices that we find immoral are normal in other societies today. Okay? And other ones, a lot of different deplorable ideas have been considered moral in the past. So examples of those would be slavery or child sacrifice, abuse, murder, genocide, sexism, racism, et cetera, right? There's all kinds of things that in the past we see were considered were fine, like they're just accepted by the culture, and nowadays we say absolutely not. So, the farther you go back and the broader you look throughout history, the more cultures you look, the more you're going to find varying beliefs and practices and all that. So very few people are willing to say that all of those things are okay just because the society that they were in were collectively agreed on to be moral. Now, we rightly, as a society, or as people, we rightly say that all of those things were wrong then, and they still are wrong, and we work as a society to reduce those type of things. So I think it's pretty clear there that morality can't be just simply subjective to groups of people, like people just get to decide what's moral for them, and it doesn't apply to anyone else. That just doesn't seem to fit either. So I'm going to say morality must be objective. Most people actually, I think, live this way, whether they actually will admit to it or not. A lot of people, they'll say, I believe that everything's, relative, and, people can come up with their own morals or something like that. But just cross them on one of their morals, and it quickly turns out that they seem to think it's very objective. So a lot of people, they're just going to say, that is absolutely just wrong. It's just wrong. They won't even necessarily know how to explain it. They just say, that is just wrong. Some people will call it a conscience. Others are going to say it's just human nature to know that those things are wrong. But if you really press a lot of these people for why they think it's wrong, few people can actually give a satisfactory answer on why they think something is objectively wrong. A lot of people just say it just is. But either someone must admit that their objective morality has to come from somewhere, or they have to admit that their morals are subjective and just essentially worthless and can be dismissed by anyone else. So the only thing that really seems to fit and makes sense is that there is a God that would have set in place certain morals that are universally and objectively true. They wouldn't change over time, depending on the person, cultures, anything like that. The idea of objective morality is usually practiced by people, even if they won't admit it. It's practically impossible to live as if morality is subjective to personal or cultural ideas. And we'll see this. So that quote I previously read from Dawkins, we don't really get the impression that that is just subjective morality that he's talking about. Like, he's saying, well, I think these things are wrong, but it's really not. Anyone else could disagree with it. No. Dawkins is stating what he believes is objectively immoral behaviors, and that most of his readers should and will agree with him on it. Right? So, now there are some other alternative origins, theories to morality of where this could have come from, because people, if they, you do kind of back them in a corner and say, look, either morality is worthless or it's objective. If it doesn't, and you say it must come from a God. There's a few other things that people will try to throw out there and say, no, here's where it came from. So probably the most scientific thing that you're going to hear is on the origin of morality is that we just evolved to have specific morals because that behavior previously led to higher rates of survival for our ancestors. I've heard that one quite a few times from a lot of different people. Another one is that your culture just decides on a morality, and then we kind of grow up accepting that, and it just becomes part of who we are because we grow up in a society that teaches that. I don't think either of those really hold a whole lot of weight. Morality can't just be a product of evolution and still be objectively true. First off, there's plenty of problems with the idea of morality being a product of evolution. First off, how would self-sacrificial care of the weak help one's genes reach greater rates of survival, right? That seems to be kind of contradictory from a evolutionary standpoint. Spending extra resources to care for unproductive members of society that are a detriment to the group doesn't usually work. Often in nature, it's the strong survive by preying off the weak, not by generously giving to them. But let's just, for the sake of argument, let's say that it's true that our ancestors with strong moral feelings, that they survived at higher rates, and let's see if that still can make sense. So, a few problems with that would be many of the morals that led to higher survival rates in the past generations will not necessarily do so today. And they might, in fact, lead to lower survival rates in modern times. So, if moral feelings are simply evolutionary holdovers, they don't really have any real relevance to us today. However, not many people want to make the claim that morals are irrelevant today. Atheist, agnostic, whatever, everyone pretty much holds to some sort of morality. Also, different people groups, their ancestors could have had totally different practices of morality that led to different survival rates in different areas, right? Like in one part of the world, maybe child sacrifice led to greater survival rates. In another part, fighting people that did, and trying to wipe out people that had child sacrifice would have had higher survival rates. So you're going to then have different people groups today that have different, morals that would be, genetically passed down to them. And how are we going to determine which one of those differing morals are right and which ones are irrelevant today? It's a massive problem to try to deal with that. Also, if we accept that moral feelings are the result of our ancestors, do we have any obligation to follow those same morals just because our ancestors did it? I don't think so. What if upon research, we find that the highest propagation and survival rates are fostered in a culture that promotes being the petty, unjust, unforgiving, control freak, on and on, the whole quote that Dawkins said. What if that behavior that Dawkins is so upset about, what if we find that that is best for surviving? Are we now going to say that's what's moral and we should do that because it helps genes survive? That's not a very satisfactory answer either. If we're going to go down that road, we're going to have to say that every behavior that helped our ancestors survive in the past would be moral. I don't think anybody wants to go down that road. So, the other argument would be that it's just something that's passed down from our culture. So we grew up in a culture that teaches something's right and wrong, so we just accept it, and that's how, there's an objective moral, and it's still objective because, it's passed down from our culture, and everyone knows it's right and wrong. I don't think that quite works either. Many of Dawkins' atheist and agnostic readers, the people that love to promote his book and everything, they're going to agree with his charge of the God of the Bible being unjust and that his characteristics are evil and immoral. Ironically, though, many of those readers got their view of morality because they were taught by their culture that certain things were right and wrong, and that cultural morality must be based on objective source, or it's not really relevant for us to follow today. We could say, sure, I grew up, in this culture, and it taught me that these things are right or wrong, so I'm going to hold on to that. But it just doesn't quite seem to hold a lot of weight because cultures have been wrong in the past. They could be wrong now. Entire countries have been wrong in very much of their beliefs. Also, our cultural ideals aren't without biblical influence, including the idea of loving our enemies, or what we may be more comfortable calling it tolerance. So many of the opponents of biblical morality are, they're trying to rid the culture of these biblical ideas, and they're not even realizing that a lot of those biblical ideas that they have, or that they're trying to get rid of, are largely responsible for our culture's or influencing our culture for the morality that we have currently. So you're not going to find a lot of this kind of freedom that we have, in cultures where Islam or atheistic communism is the major influence on morality. Our culture was largely influenced by generations of biblical Christian thinking and the morality that came out of that religious philosophy. So it's kind of interesting, but we have a culture that was largely Christian, so we learn these Christian morals. People kind of turn away from God, but they've kept the morality, and now they're trying to turn that morality against Christianity to start with. They're cutting the legs out from under their own argument. They don't realize that, but that's exactly what's happening. So, I was going to kind of shift over to more of emotional arguments on morality, which is more of dealing with the problem of evil. I think we're just going to kind of skip that for now. We can maybe jump into that with discussion. So once again, kind of this basic moral argument, though, it's just that if there is, morality seems to point to a God, because if there are morals, then it seems that they must be objective and not just subjective. And if there is objective, it has to come from somewhere, and that somewhere makes most sense to be from God. So just to kind of get that into everyone's head and kind of get you guys comfortable with making those arguments, just kind of thought maybe we could have a couple people come up here and we could kind of go through some different arguments of things that you all hear. Like when people come up and say, well, I don't like Christianity because you guys are all this, or this, or Christians always are problems in this area. Those are making moral arguments. So I want us to all kind of get comfortable with taking that, seeing where the issue is with, what the moral argument that they're making is, and then kind of turn that back in on itself. So I don't know is there a couple people that would feel comfortable wanting to come up and kind of practice a few of these moral arguments? Jerry? Jerry's always in for the moral arguments. Anyone else? I don't know if we want to keep the mic or take that off and it's kind of more of a discussion, transition more to a discussion.
You keep it, and I'll just talk loud. Do I need a partner, or?
I can help.
Shelby just recommended
Yeah.
just a volunteer.
Okay. And then we can just kind of, let's move this out.
Yeah, let me go head to head against my friend theologian. That sounds good.
All right, so
This is friendly fire.
So basically the idea is here, we're going to take a, common argument against, Christians or God, something that you might hear all the time, and then, sure, absolutely. So,
You're the plaintiff.
and then,
You can fight for Christianity.
Okay.
I think you might be able to do that a little bit stronger than me.
so what's a common argument you hear against Christianity as far as, like, attacking them for something they do wrong?
Oh, man. Wow, where do I start? Right.
Off to a good start.
We've all had a time. I would say if someone's lifestyle isn't hurting someone else, where's the harm in it? So if someone's gay or if someone is trans, like, why wouldn't we be tolerant of that? God made them that way.
So you're basically saying it's that Christians are too intolerant
Yes,
of other,
they're
so,
intolerant,
and you
yeah.
think that's wrong?
Yes, of different
Okay.
people's lifestyles. They're not doing anything wrong. They're not hurting anyone else.
So you think that's why God couldn't exist, is because of that?
Yeah, and people are just created that way, and evolution and all that.
It's a good one. This one we hear a lot. So are y'all thinking about any moral implications that she's charging against Christians and God? You guys see what it is?
It's a claim to justice. She's saying it's an unjust behavior on the Christian part.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's inconsistent with the love ethic. You say you love people, but you're not loving these people.
I think also something is inherent that they're making a judgment call on what they consider to be non-harmful behavior. Whereas same-sex relationships, they're claiming to be completely innocuous, like just what's wrong with it? Nobody's hurting anybody. And I think that that's a mistake where you can bring in, well, why do you think that there's no harm in having a same-sex relationship?
Because it's just love.
So if you love something, then it's okay to do what you want.
Yeah, and it's two consenting adults. Why is it a problem?
What if I love to do something that could then be destructive?
Okay, well, yeah, that's a problem.
Like, it's maybe the same thing of two consensual adults having a same-sex relationship may be different than saying that I love to harm animals or something like that.
Yes.
But just the basis of love itself is a false premise. I would probably come back and push in that direction.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, you can
So
go a
we
lot of
have
different arguments.
of
But,
against God's existence in general.
like, if you're like, I don't believe in Christianity because
Okay, well,
because
science,
I won't,
bang.
I won't, well, more of a moral argument. So like what you just said, I don't want to be a Christian, and I don't believe in God because Christians are horrible, and God, the Bible says all these bad things about God, and that doesn't promote gay marriage or so on. So
Right.
that same thing you're saying. So how do you, there's a moral argument against God in that, right?
Mm-hmm.
You all see what that is? What she's saying, basically Christians are intolerant, and that's evil, right? But
Well, that we're being accused of some sort of injustice, like Sean said, is that, that's the part of the humanism I talked about this morning, is they want to fight for human rights and the full expression of the human life, and therefore to deny any part of a person's exploration and indulgence of that would be a kind of like a fault against them, and they would be seen as intolerant and judgmental and even bigoted.
okay, but let's make the moral argument for God in response to that. So, you want to or you want to?
To what she just
Yes,
said about
right.
the science argument?
Or the first one about basically Christians are intolerant and such. So, like a moral argument. So, like what I'm talking about here, the moral argument would be say, okay, so basically you're. Let me just. I'll run with this for a second. So, okay, so you're basically you don't like Christians and you're not going to believe in God because you say Christians are intolerant and they're unjust. They're basically you think they're evil.
Yeah.
So, where do you think? So basically, you think things are right and wrong, good and right. Right and wrong, good and evil. Where do you think that idea that things are good and evil comes from?
I think it's just evolved over time in our society, and it's just it's innate. People know what's right and wrong.
Okay, so pretty much if we've evolved to think something's right or wrong, then that's what is right or wrong.
Yes.
So if we go through science and we find out that anything happened to evolve that way, we're going to now say that's okay. So what if we find through a lot of scientific study that people have evolved to have a violent tendency and want to murder people? Should we embrace that?
No, because we shouldn't kill people.
What if we were to find out that we were evolved to not like homosexual tendencies because they don't tend to promote more children, which is primarily the idea where evolution comes from. The greater number of ancestors you're going to, or a greater number of children you're going to have, the greater your genes will survive. That idea.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. One. I got nothing for that.
So see, you don't have to. Here's where this argument, the moral argument for God, comes in. Is like so many of these criticisms against Christians they're basically saying Christians are immoral, they're wrong, they're doing something evil. Just flip that around. Don't even try to necessarily. I mean, once you get to that point, it's a good spot to say launch into why Christians feel what things are right and wrong, where we, why we necessarily think things are just or injustice, and you can kind of move in a different way. But first off, I mean, you can just disable someone's argument so quick like that just by saying you really don't even have a right to argue what you're arguing, right? So, and we can do this with any different type of thing, really. So,
I think also something that you point out really good, Kenny, is there's always an underlying premise for which somebody feels is the right basis to make the claim. And a lot of times it's not on the surface. For example, the claim that Shelby was saying, she didn't outright say that she believed that an evolved consciousness or highly integrated cerebral processes were able to make moral judgments, but that's the basis for her claim. And so Kenny's just saying kind of like, if you understand where somebody's base is at, you can turn the question out and push in that direction. And I think that's the way to not get caught up in their sort of game that they're playing to try to convince you, is to sort of ask them the questions that put them sort of in the corner, kind of like, what do you call it, turn the table on them. Yeah.
All right, so do you want to try to like counter one against me, like if I... Okay, sure. Okay, so let's see.
Yes.
Okay, so you're here for a, kind of a Christian conference. I just can't understand why anyone would want to be a Christian when there's such, arrogant people that just want to push their ideas onto everyone else.
Well, I guess I would say that I am not trying to push my ideas on everyone else because I want to have absolute truth that I can't come up with myself, but I want to get from God. So I'm searching Scripture and I'm searching for truth to find that from God.
Okay, great answer.
Yeah.
Great answer. But I was going to look for a little bit different one, so John's waving. Yes, John. Okay, so so listen carefully. I'm making a moral criticism against Christianity, right? I don't understand why anyone would want to be a Christian because all they want to do is push their ideas onto everyone else, right? So think carefully. What's the moral criticism they're making?
Oh, well, you're criticizing me for being here as well.
Bingo.
So get off my case.
Exactly. So
You're pushing your
Anti-belief.
non-evangelism belief. You're evangelizing your non-evangelism onto her.
Yeah.
So that, basically the criticism you're making of her, you're doing.
exactly.
So you're not, that's cheating.
See,
That's cheating.
exactly. It is. It is, and people get away with this all the time because we don't call people on it. Yeah.
Well, that's like relativism. Philosophers, and Dale, you can also comment, they acknowledge that relativism is actually impossible because you can't actually maintain the position and yet be relative about it. Like it's a contradiction.
I've learned is let them talk. They'll talk themselves right back out of the conversation. Just listen to them. Let them talk, and then say, "You just contradicted yourself," because they will.
Mm-hmm.
Their own statements.
So-
Even about life, they'll say something's immoral about life, but then they'll say it's okay to do this over here. It's immoral to kill anybody in a prison, but it's okay to kill a baby, no matter what stage. You just kind of point that out, isn't all life precious? And they'll say, yeah. Oh, wait a minute, you said it's not over here.
Yeah. And the point I'm really trying to get to is not even to try to engage people and like argue out. That first step, just try to, this kind of, like Jerry said, it turns the tables and kind of makes them think, whoa, I don't even know what I'm talking about right now. So listen when someone makes a point against God of a reason why they don't think God exists, and usually it has a moral implication behind it. Some people will say, well, scientifically I think this, and this makes more sense, and I mean, that's going to be a really long debate to get into. Most people you're going to run into are just going to say, I don't like God because of this, or I can't believe in God because... what's one you guys hear pretty frequently? Like, throw some out there.
Well, the hypocrisy of Christians.
Right, kind of what we just did, right? It's pretty similar to that. Christians are all hypocrites and they don't live by their own rules. Is that what you're getting?
There's a lot of teeth in that argument. If you look at Christian history over the last couple of thousand years, it's been mostly a train wreck.
Yeah.
Just saying,
So, yeah. And I tend to sympathize with a lot of people that argue that against Christians, and I would, probably go down the road of saying I agree with you on that, and I don't think...
So you would just concede the point.
What I'm saying is we don't even go down that road. We just turn the tables on them to start with. So they say, but I would later on concede that point to kind of build rapport with people, but someone comes up and they say, Christians are a bunch of hypocrites. They're always teaching, people to do morality, and they're always trying to get people to live the right way, and then they're guilty of more sins and crimes than anyone else. And they'll turn that as like a reason not to believe in God, right? But what we just covered was that they don't have a reason to even have objective morals to criticize Christianity without a God. So basically, so you're saying Christians and the Bible, we'll just say Christianity as a whole is very evil. Well, where do you think that evil comes from? All right, we turn the tables on them on that way, and then just kind of let them kind of, it's an easy way to turn it right on them.